with his trademark charisma and impeccable timing, welcoming some of Hollywood's biggest names into America's living rooms. But behind that precisely choreographed Tonight Show machine, television's toughest loose cannon was afoot. Celebrities who had indulged a little too freely before the broadcast day had begun. It was an age before publicists scripted every word of an interview, before the proliferation of social media could instantly destroy a career with one poorly worded blunder. And so, into NBC's Burbank studios, 3 sheets to the wind, came legendary guests of The Tonight Show, with legendary results, both wonderful and appalling. Tonight, we'll count down the 8 most intoxicated guests who came sloshed through The Tonight Show's doors. Moments that network executives would surely have paid big bucks to erase from their collective memory banks, and that fans would never let them live down. From legendary OA winning guests who couldn't recall what street they were on, to Hollywood icons who almost took a tumble off that iconic couch, these were more than embarrassing interviews. Ed Reader Live TV that walked a precariously narrow line between spectacular entertainment and catastrophe. And the best part? Watching legendary host Johnny Carson spin these roasted squirrels into a memorable Tonight Show experience with his trademark poise, trademark charisma, or trademark irritation. And often with enough suggestive innuendo struck with catty one-liners by aides to Ed McMahon to make it clear that everyone, the celebrity guest, the network, everyone, knew exactly what was what, without upsetting the glassy-eyed celebrity guest's fragile grip on reality. Of course, not every guest could be rescued from the brink of disaster, and some of these guests would never get invited back to The Tonight Show again. But that would never happen, of course. Not with the irreplaceable Johnny Carson standing officiously between TV disaster and the nation's living room couches. So let's get to it, and let's get some drinks. Not necessarily like what these celebrities consumed, by the way, but some stiff drink or another should do just fine. Now let's count down the 8 drunken guests of The Tonight Show who almost brought live TV to its knees with awkward conversations, banter that never happened, or presentation that could make you, or me, or almost any of us laugh, cringe, or both. While broken souls are almost as good as broken sob ceremonies for TV purposes, count on it, it would still never happen with Johnny Carson standing by. So let the good times roll, and let the reminiscences of 8 drunken guests of The Tonight Show roll too. 8 times the brightest lights in Hollywood came to Studio One in Burbank. It is apparent they had stopped off at the bar 1 or 2 too many times. Towns, the hangings were all public for the squares, and everyone came from hundreds of miles around. So it became a big one. Truman Capote, the genius writer who couldn't string a sentence together. When Truman Capote appeared on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson in 1980, it was clear that something was very wrong. This is a man who had written some of the greatest literature of the last 100 years with such books as In Cold Blood and Breakfast at Tiffany's, who was respected for his biting observations and acute insight into the human condition, who could barely make his way from behind the curtain to the guest chair without stumbling. What ensued was likely one of the most uncomfortable 17 minutes in the history of The Tonight Show. When Carson welcomed Capote to the show with the customary, "It's great to have you with us tonight," it became immediately apparent that Capote was severely intoxicated. His response, what was no doubt intended to be a biting observation or joke, came off more like a mere mumble that left Carson straining to hear as he leaned in with a carrot top. "I'm sorry. What was that?" It only got worse. Throughout the questioning, Capote slurred his words so badly that it became difficult for Carson, a master of understanding guests through their nervousness or accent, to make any sense of what the writer was trying to say. When attempting to talk about his latest novel, Capote embarked on some sort of tangent that wandered through more areas of discussion than one could count, eventually ending up with some sort of far-off tale about Montgomery Cliff that seemed to have no beginning or end whatever. The crowd, initially excited to have the great writer appear before them, became increasingly uncomfortable throughout the ordeal. Laughter echoed through the room as Capote, apparently caught up in the euphoric moment, turned to Ed McMahon with the question of if he could sit in the announcer's lap, because you look so comfortable like a teddy bear. It was McMahon's look of utter shock that became one of the highlights of the evening. He repeatedly tried to get Capote to focus with more targeted questions about his writing process or literary influences, lifelines that Capoe failed to understand as he careened into increasingly weird non sequiturs. This hit a low point about 12 minutes into the appearance, as Capoe tried to take a sip of water, almost completely missing the glass in the process, spewing water down his front and onto his shirt. Instead of moving on, he kept speaking as if nothing happened, with a large wet spot on his front for the millions of viewers to witness. As the painful appearance finally came to a merciful end, Carson called for an emergency commercial break. Rare event that for Carson was only called for in extreme interviewing situations. Caught by the camera blowing a sigh of relief as it switched away, a respite that was never supposed to air, but made it into broadcast through the lag of the director's reaction, an important point that would carry over into the aftermath of the appearance. According to reports, backstage Carson told his producer that it wasn't an interview. It was a hostage situation in slow motion. As Carson vowed, Capoe never again made an appearance on The Tonight Show, while Carson was host, ending with the expiration of his tenure, despite the author's established literary reputation and past positive appearances. It was the Capoe appearance that was perhaps most painful in its aftermath for what it revealed about the guest's impaired state through public consumption of alcohol. It was oh so hard to watch Capoe reveal through both word and deed such a profound disparity between the intelligent public figure that millions of people took for granted on televisions nationwide, as contrasted with the mumbling presence that millions of people took for the appearance that night. A humiliating public revelation of Capoe's personal struggles with what would eventually contribute to his poor health in his ultimate years. A powerful image of what a sharp detractor could do to massive intellectual power that pervaded televisions across the nation. Time in my life. I would like to thank very much my director, Mr. Guy Green. 2. Shelley Winters, the hurricane in human form. If Johnny Carson had any unofficial rankings of difficult guests that he encountered, then without a shadow of a doubt, one individual who would almost assuredly break into the top 10 would be Shelley Winters. She was an actress who held multiple Academy Awards. However, her Tonight Show spots often involved a more personal type of drama, the type that stemmed from cocktail parties before the show, where any concepts of what a TV interview should or could be were carelessly disregarded. Winters' consistency in rolling up to the Tonight Show Wamra, very intoxicated, became so legendary that Tonight Show staff had a policy for dealing with her, position her as a second or third guest, hoping she would work off enough of her buzz waiting back in her dressing room. This plan rarely worked, since winners of such drinking binges would continue until they were called out on stage. This appearance would end up being one of the most infamous of her Tonight Show appearances in 1974, where she was ostensibly booked with the sole purpose of promoting her autobiography. Moments after stepping onto the set, it was clear that something was off as Winters stumbled about in her heels, which looked disturbingly high. It was also clear from that point that this would not be a typical episode of Tonight Show. While introduction by Carson was still spilling over into her initial remarks, this came to a screeching halt as she dived into a personal anecdote that went entirely outside of any context of her appearance's announced purpose. This type of behavior would continue with no signs of slowing down as Winters talked over host Carson multiple times, cutting off answers before he could even pose one, or addressing multiple members of the live studio audience directly, despite host Carson sitting right beside her. Matters would become enough of a mess that another guest would introduce himself for a spot on the couch. Instead of allowing host Carson to conduct his questions with that guest, she would aggressively cut in, physically gesturing by placing her hand on the clearly embarrassed guest's knee while informing him that he looked like a young Errol Flynn. This was made worse by her loudly informing host Carson that his movie isn't very good, but he's pretty to look at. Host Carson, who was by reputation composed or professional regardless of any type of Tonight Show appearance, looked like he had bitten into a lemon for the first time in his life. He strained to regain any semblance of order in his own show, clearly visible to the viewing public that were huddled before their TV screens. At one point, the camera captured him firing off a pleading look at Ed McMahon, who could only shrug hopelessly from his sidekick chair. It wasn't until Winters, clearly disgruntled with the attention Carson was paying to her anecdotes, reached out to physically strip the note cards from his hand, lofting them carelessly over her shoulder while declaring, "You won't be needing those, Johnny. I'm far more interesting." Cards went flying across the stage floor as the audience gasped in shock. After finally extricating himself to end the bit with a second pre-commercial break, Carson allegedly told his producer, "If she's booked again, I'm staying home that night." He kept his word, keeping Winters' name off the guest list of The Tonight Show for almost 3 years, a glaring absence for such a prominent actress. When Winters finally returned in 1977, it was with certain conditions in mind, including conducting her noon tape show interview, which would reduce the chances for pre-show heavy drinking, as well as an understanding that any further instances of this type of behavior would effectively blacklist her from further Tonight Show appearances. As one Tonight staff writer erstwhile captured Winters' attitude toward Tonight Show guest spots, she didn't sip, she stormed. It was the intoxicated performance itself that made Winters' appearances such a nightmare for the Tonight Show crew, and, of course, for host Johnny Carson himself. Because unlike some guests who merely mumbled incoherently into the mic, Winters actually became bolder, more outspoken, and completely unwilling to adhere to the simplest tenets of a talk show interview. Within Carson's consummately produced televisual universe, she became the hurricane that no amount of page preparation could withstand. Don't you folks never ask me questions? Of course. Couldn't I try it? 'Cause everybody wants to say it's a problem. 3. Dean Martin, when the act stopped being an act. All of Dean Martin's public image was predicated on a pleasant, loose-laced dringer's demeanor. Martin with martini glass in hand, with slightly relaxed eye, with subtle dance moves as he crooned. These were, of course, elements of a precisely constructed public image that had made Martin one of the more lovable princes of the entertainment universe. Experts for years confirmed that Martin's drinking was mostly for publicity purposes, that the glass was often filled with apple juice instead of the hard stuff, or that his intoxicated routines were just for effect. When it came to his Tonight Show appearances, this image of Martin worked to his advantage, as he guest starred on the show on multiple instances in the 1960s into the 1970s. Martin would appear to be half in the bag, then regale the crowd with his slurred one-liners, playing up his image for everyone to enjoy while at the same time serving up some excellent professional entertainment. In on the joke was Johnny Carson himself, who often gave Martin opportunities to dispense with his drunken one-liners with such questions as, "How much of this stuff you got in you tonight, Dean?" However, Martin's appearances on The Tonight Show would undergo a significant shift by the mid-1970s. Those who were closest to Martin would comment that what had initially begun as a bit of a gimmick had increasingly become the truth, the entertainer resorting more often to alcohol in order to dull the pain of personal tragedies, such as the loss of his own son, who took his own life at the age of only 18, or the destruction of his marriage. This shift from show business entertainment to real became starkly visible on one of Martin's appearances for The Tonight Show in 1976, which would make it one of the show's more awkward moments. Martin came on as the big guest, supposedly publicizing his upcoming NBC special. From prior to Martin's entrance, however, it became evident that something about Martin's appearance would be decidedly different from what had become one of Martin's signature roles in subsequent show business appearances, namely that of the dancing, drink-saturated entertainer who could pour on his lovable, slightly intoxicated repartees with the same relish with which Martin himself could graciously tolerate the diminutive guest Ed Edwards' small-time antics for a roomful of smirking strangers.